I know, I look vaguely familiar.
Yes.
You feel you've seen me somewhere before.
Hollywood has always been in the business of keeping secrets, and some of the biggest ones were not about films or feuds or box office. Some of them were about children, born quietly, raised in the shadows of famous names, sometimes never acknowledged at all. The studios had the machinery for it, the lawyers, the arrangements, the press relationships, and they used all of it. These are 10 old Hollywood stars who had secret children from affairs, and the stories behind them are some of the most human things Hollywood ever produced. Number 10. Clark Gable. Clark Gable spent his career playing men of straightforward moral character. The honest guy, the reliable one, the man who did what needed to be done. His private life operated on considerably more complicated terms, and the most striking example of that gap was a daughter he fathered and never publicly acknowledged. Born William Clark Gable in Cadiz, Ohio, on February 1st, 1901, he had been working his way through Hollywood's social world since the late 1920s, and the relationships he accumulated along the way included a liaison with actress Loretta Young that produced consequences neither of them had planned. The story emerged in stages over many decades, with the complete picture only assembling clearly after Young's death. During the filming of The Call of the Wild in 1935, Gable and Young, both of whom were involved with other people, had an affair. Young became pregnant. What followed was managed with the specific machinery that Hollywood in the 1930s applied to situations it could not permit to be publicly known. Young disappeared from public view, gave birth to a daughter named Judith in November 1935, placed the child in an orphanage briefly, and then adopted her in 1937 in a legal arrangement that obscured the actual parentage. Judith Lewis grew up knowing Loretta Young as her mother and not knowing who her father was. Young told her the truth eventually, though accounts differ about the timing and the circumstances. Young herself spent decades deflecting questions about Judith's origins with a consistency that suggested how thoroughly she had internalized the need for the concealment. She acknowledged the affair with Gable shortly before her death in 2000 in an interview that confirmed what many in Hollywood had known for decades. Gable was never informed that he had fathered a child. Whether Young made that choice to protect him, to protect herself, or to protect the child is a question that her biographers have addressed without reaching consensus. Judith Lewis Tinney, as she became, lived her adult life with the knowledge of who her father was and the understanding that the industry that had made him famous had also made that knowledge impossible to use. Clark Gable died on November 16, 1960 in Los Angeles at the age of 59. He never publicly acknowledged Judith Young as his daughter. Number 9. Gary Merrill. Gary Merrill is remembered primarily as Bette Davis's fourth husband, the man she met while filming All About Eve in 1950, who became the only husband she later described as a genuine partner, and from whom she was divorced in 1960 in proceedings conducted with the mutual animosity of people who had once felt very strongly in the opposite direction. Born Gary Franklin Merrill in Hartford, Connecticut, on August 2, 1915, Merrill built his film career in the late 1940s and early 1950s with genuine ability and solid credits. 12 O'Clock High in 1949, opposite Gregory Peck, gave him a strong dramatic vehicle. All About Eve in 1950 gave him Davis. Their marriage lasted a decade and produced the adoption of 2 children, Michael and Margot, alongside Davis's daughter, B.D., who was from an earlier relationship. What was less publicly discussed during the years of his prominence was the full extent of his romantic history before and during his association with Davis. The marriage to Davis consumed public attention in the way that anything connected to Davis tended to, and the years that preceded it received considerably less scrutiny. Merrill had been involved in relationships prior to Davis that the industry managed with its customary efficiency and that he did not discuss publicly with any regularity. His post-Davis career continued in film and television through the 1960s and 1970s. He appeared in Coma in 1978 and The Missouri Breaks in 1976. But the significant productions of his earlier career did not continue at the same pace after the marriage ended. He settled in Maine in his later years, where he was involved in Democratic Party politics and ran unsuccessfully for the Maine state legislature in 1970. His relationship with Davis, even after the divorce, continued to generate press interest in ways that overshadowed the rest of his biography. Davis spoke of him with a mixture of fondness and grief that she did not apply to her other former husbands. Gary Merrill died on March 5, 1990, in Falmouth, Maine, at the age of 74. Number 8. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison's romantic life was one of the most extensively reported in British and American entertainment across 4 decades. 5 marriages before his 6th and final one, several affairs of significant duration, and a relationship with actress Carol Landis in 1948, whose ending was the most devastating event connected to his name. Born Reginald Carey Harrison in Houghton, Lancashire, England on March 5, 1908, Harrison had built a stage and film career of considerable distinction by the late 1940s. Major Barbara in 1941, Blithe Spirit in 1945, Anna and the King of Siam in 1946, and the theatrical work in London and New York that established him as one of the finest light comedic actors of his generation gave him a standing that survived considerable personal turbulence. He was married to his second wife, actress Lily Palmer, when his affair with Carol Landis began during the filming of Unfaithfully Yours in 1948. Landis, an American actress who had built a significant Hollywood career through the early 1940s, with films including 1 Million BC in 1940 and Topper Returns in 1941, fell deeply in love with Harrison during the production. Harrison was not prepared to leave Palmer for her. Landis died by suicide on July 5, 1948, and Harrison was the person who found her body at her home in Bel Air. The scandal surrounding her death generated press coverage on both sides of the Atlantic and damaged his American career temporarily, while following his public biography permanently. His son, Noel Harrison, born on January 29, 1934, to Noel Marjorie Thomas, a relationship that preceded Harrison's more publicly documented marriages, grew up to become a performer in his own right. He achieved his greatest commercial success through the theme song to the Thomas Crown Affair in 1968, a recording that reached the top 20 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. And he had a career in acting and recording that spanned several decades. The circumstances of his birth, to a woman who was not Rex Harrison's wife at the time, during a period of Harrison's life that preceded the more publicized relationships, were managed with the discretion the era applied to such situations, and Noel's parentage was not a subject of extensive public discussion during his father's peak years. Rex Harrison's 6 marriages included unions with Noel Marjorie Thomas, Lily Palmer, Kay Kendall, who died of leukemia in 1959 during their marriage, a loss Harrison described as permanent, Rachel Roberts, Elizabeth Reese Harris, and Marcia Tinker. He died on June 2, 1990 in New York City at the age of 82 from pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks after his final marriage. Number 7. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin fathered children by multiple women across a career and a personal life that operated simultaneously, and that the studio machinery of the silent and early sound era managed with the thoroughness such machinery was designed to apply. The children in his case were not always secret in the sense of being entirely unknown. Some were known within Hollywood, but they were managed in ways designed to minimize public awareness and protect the carefully constructed image of the comedian whose little tramp character had made him the most beloved performer in the world. Born Charles Spencer Chaplin in London on April 16, 1889, Chaplin had established his pattern of relationships with very young women from his earliest years of Hollywood fame, a pattern that produced both marriages, several legal crises, and children whose existence the industry managed with varying degrees of thoroughness. His first wife, Mildred Harris, whom he married in October 1918 when she was 17, gave birth to a severely deformed son named Norman Spencer Chaplin in July 1919, who lived only 3 days. His second wife, Leda Gray, 15 when he began pursuing her, 16 when he married her in November 1924, gave birth to 2 acknowledged sons, Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. in May 1925 and Sidney Earl Chaplin in March 1926. Both boys grew up with knowledge of their father and variable degrees of relationship with him. The relationship that brought the most significant legal complications was with Joan Barry, an actress Chaplin had been involved with in the early 1940s. Barry filed a paternity suit against him in 1943, claiming he had fathered her daughter, Carol Ann. Chaplin denied paternity. Blood tests conducted at the time, which by modern standards would have been considered insufficiently sophisticated, were interpreted as exculpatory. The jury in the civil case nevertheless found against him in 1945, and he was ordered to pay child support for Carol Ann Barry, despite the blood test evidence. The case generated enormous press coverage and contributed to the political and legal climate that eventually led to his exile from the United States in 1952. His final family with Una O'Neill, 8 children born between 1944 and 1962, the last when Chaplin was 73 years old, was entirely public and by all accounts, a genuinely loving domestic life that stood in complete contrast to the arrangements of his earlier years. Charlie Chaplin died on December 25, 1977, in Corsier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, at the age of 88. Number 6. Cary Grant. Cary Grant's public image was one of the most carefully maintained in Hollywood history. The effortless elegance, the perfectly calibrated charm, the romantic lead whose screen presence suggested someone entirely comfortable in every social situation. His private life was considerably more complicated, and the complexity included relationships and their consequences that the industry managed with the thoroughness it applied to all threats to commercially valuable images. Born Archibald Alexander Leach in Bristol, England, on January 18, 1904, Grant had built his Hollywood persona through decades of deliberate self-construction, transforming the working-class Bristol boy into the quintessential Hollywood gentleman through sheer professional discipline and physical advantage. He was married 5 times, to Virginia Cherrill in 1934, to Barbara Hutton in 1942, to Betsy Drake in 1949, to Diane Cannon in 1965, and to Barbara Harris in 1981, and the relationships he maintained between and alongside those marriages were managed with a privacy that the studio system facilitated and that he protected with considerable personal investment. His daughter, Jennifer Grant, born on February 26, 1966, to Diane Cannon during their marriage, was his only officially acknowledged child. Grant was 61 years old at her birth, an age at which most of his contemporaries were grandparents, and the late-life fatherhood gave him, by all accounts, something he had not previously experienced. Jennifer has written and spoken about him with warmth throughout her adult life, describing a father who was present and affectionate in ways that his earlier biography had not always suggested he was capable of being. The custody proceedings that followed his divorce from Cannon in 1968 generated press coverage that Grant found deeply intrusive and that he resisted strenuously. He was protective of Jennifer's exposure to the press through the remaining 18 years of his life, and the two had a relationship that Jennifer has consistently described as one of the most important of her life. Whether the relationships Grant maintained before and between his marriages produced children who were managed out of public knowledge is a question that the documented biographical record does not definitively resolve. Several biographers have raised the question without finding evidence sufficient to answer it. Cary Grant died on November 29, 1986, in Davenport, Iowa, at the age of 82 from a cerebral hemorrhage. Number 5. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich's personal life was conducted with a directness that was, in some ways, the opposite of concealment. She was openly bisexual at a time when such openness was professionally dangerous. She maintained long-term relationships with both men and women simultaneously, and she spoke about her life with a frankness that her contemporaries found either admirable or scandalous, depending on their own relationship to convention. Born Marie Magdalene Dietrich in Berlin on December 27, 1901, Dietrich had married Rudolf Sieber in 1923 and had a daughter, Maria, with him in 1924. The marriage became an arrangement almost immediately. Sieber knew about Dietrich's affairs and maintained his own long-term relationship with dancer Tamara Matul for decades. The arrangement suited both of them and lasted technically until Sieber's death in 1976, 53 years after the wedding. The affairs Dietrich conducted during her Hollywood peak years in the 1930s and 1940s included relationships of varying duration with Gary Cooper, John Gilbert, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the French actor Jean Gabin, with whom her relationship was among the most serious of her life, and several women, including the French singer Edith Piaf. The studio system managed the consequences of those relationships with the efficiency it brought to all commercially valuable situations, and Dietrich's international standing meant that the management extended across several countries and several studio systems simultaneously. What emerges from her daughter, Maria Riva's 1992 memoir, the most detailed account of Dietrich's private life written by anyone with direct personal knowledge of it, is a portrait of a woman whose emotional management of her own life extended to consequences of her relationships in ways that prioritized her public image and her freedom of movement over everything else. Riva describes specific instances of pregnancies privately during Dietrich's peak years and the infrastructure of arrangements that surrounded those situations, with a candor that the memoir's publication, more than 2 decades after the period in question, made possible. Dietrich's relationship with Maria was itself complicated in the ways that her daughter has documented at length. Warm in some periods, cold in others, always shaped by the specific requirements of Dietrich's self-concept and career management. Marlene Dietrich died on May 6, 1992 in Paris at the age of 90. Number 4. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn fathered children with the same enthusiasm and the same disregard for consequence that characterized most of his activities. His 3 marriages produced acknowledged children: 1 son with Lily Demita, 2 daughters with Nora Eddington, and a daughter with Patrice Wymore. But the relationships conducted alongside and between those marriages produced additional children, whose existence the industry managed with varying degrees of success. Born in Hobart, Tasmania, on June 20, 1909, Flynn had established his pattern of behavior before his first Hollywood film was complete. Warner Brothers maintained what amounted to an informal damage control operation around him, monitoring which stories were approaching publication, negotiating with editors, and managing the financial consequences of his personal behavior through arrangements that kept the most damaging information out of the mainstream press. He was commercially valuable enough in his peak years to justify that investment, and the studio made it. His son, Sean Flynn, born to Lily Demita during their marriage in May 1941, grew up largely apart from his father and pursued a career as a photojournalist in the late 1960s that took him to Vietnam and Cambodia. He disappeared in Cambodia in April 1970, along with fellow photojournalist Dana Stone, while covering the conflict, and was declared legally dead in 1984. His fate was never definitively established, and the mystery of his disappearance became one of the more haunting footnotes to Flynn's biography. His daughters, Deirdre Flynn and Rory Flynn, both born to Nora Eddington, Deirdre in 1945 and Rory in 1947, grew up with more consistent contact with their father than Sean had. Deirdre became an actress. Rory became a filmmaker who made a documentary about her father's life. The additional children fathered outside Flynn's marriages are addressed with varying specificity in the biographies of him. Some researchers have identified specific cases, others have noted the general pattern without being able to document individual instances with the evidence available. Flynn's own memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, addressed his personal behavior with a candor calibrated to entertain, rather than to confess. Errol Flynn died on October 14, 1959, in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the age of 50. Number 3. Loretta Young. Loretta Young's relationship to the subject of secret children from Hollywood affairs is the most documented and the most personal on this list, because she was not the father of the secret child, but the mother, and the secret she kept was one she carried for the rest of her life, with a specific kind of Catholic guilt that she addressed in interviews only when she felt she had no other option. Born Gretchen Young in Salt Lake City, Utah, on January 6, 1913, Young had been performing since childhood and was a contracted player at Warner Brothers as a teenager. By the time she starred opposite Clark Gable in The Call of the Wild in 1935, she was 22 years old, deeply Catholic, and about to find herself pregnant following an affair with her married co-star. The management of the pregnancy was a masterpiece of 1930s Hollywood concealment. Young traveled, disappeared from public view, gave birth to a daughter named Judith in November 1935, placed the child in an orphanage briefly, and then staged a formal adoption in 1937 that gave the child a legitimate legal status while obscuring her actual parentage. Judith grew up with her mother, knowing that she was adopted, not knowing who her father was, and gradually piecing together a picture that Young would not fully confirm for decades. Young's public persona was built explicitly around her Catholic faith and her moral standards. She ran a swear jar on her film sets and donated the proceeds to charity. She spoke openly about her religious commitments. She maintained an image of propriety that was sincere in some respects and deeply complicated in others. The gap between that image and the secret she was keeping was something she lived with for the rest of her life. She acknowledged the affair with Gable and confirmed that Judith was her biological daughter rather than an adoptee in an interview shortly before her death. Not with relief, exactly, but with the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Loretta Young died on August 12, 2000 in Los Angeles at the age of 87. Number 2. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando fathered at least 11 children by multiple women, a number confirmed across decades of biographical research, and that may not be complete. The children he acknowledged came from relationships across 4 decades of his personal life, and the distinction between the acknowledged and the unacknowledged is, in some cases, a distinction that changed over time as women came forward and paternity became a matter of legal or biographical record. Born on April 3, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska, Brando was famous from the early 1950s onward for a combination of professional intensity and personal opacity that made the details of his private life difficult to track, even for the people professionally involved in tracking them. He had children by his 3 wives, Ana Kashfi, Movita Castaneda, and Tarita Teripaya, and by other women whose relationships to him ranged from brief to sustained to deeply complicated. His acknowledged children include Christian Brando, born to Ana Kashfi in May 1958, Miko Brando, born to Movita Castaneda in October 1961, and Tehotu Brando and Cheyenne Brando, born to Tarita Teripaya in 1963 and 1970 respectively. He also acknowledged Rebecca Brando, born in 1966, Petra Branda, born to an unidentified woman, Miles Jonathan Brando, born in 1992 to Brando's assistant, and several others through paternity acknowledgments that came in various forms across his later years. His son, Christian Brando, had a life shaped by the specific difficulties of being his father's child, the prolonged and damaging custody battle between his parents, the instability of his upbringing as a child, moved between increasingly dysfunctional households, and the shooting of his sister, Cheyenne's boyfriend, Doug Drolet, in May 1990 at Brando's Mulholland Drive home, for which Christian was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and served 5 years in federal prison. Christian Brando died in January 2008 at the age of 49 from pneumonia. His daughter, Cheyenne Brando, raised largely in Tahiti by her mother Tarita, suffered a breakdown in the aftermath of the Drolet shooting. She had been present and was the mother of Drolet's child, and died by suicide in April 1995 at the age of 25 at her mother's home in Papeete. The losses of Christian and Cheyenne within 13 years of each other constituted a grief that Brando carried through the final years of his life. Marlon Brando died on July 1, 2004 in Los Angeles at the age of 80. Number 1. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy's secret child was not a child in the way that most of the other secrets on this list were secret. The existence of his son John was publicly known, John's mother was his wife, and the family was not concealed from public view. What was secret? What Tracy kept hidden for decades and managed with a specific kind of guilt that the people close to him described as fundamental to his character, was the nature of his relationship to his son's disability and what he had done and not done about it. Born on April 5, 1900 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Tracy married Louise Treadwell in 1923, and their son John was born in 1924. John was discovered to be profoundly deaf, a condition that Tracy irrationally but persistently believed was connected to his own moral failures. The specific shape of that guilt, Catholic, sustained, and self-punishing, drove him toward alcohol and away from his family in ways that were causally connected even when the connection was not publicly visible. The John Tracy Clinic, which Louise established in 1942 to provide education and support for deaf children and their families, became one of the most significant contributions either Tracy made to the world outside film. The clinic pioneered early intervention education for deaf children, working with infants and toddlers and their parents at a time when most educational institutions for the deaf did not begin working with children until school age. Tracy provided financial support for the clinic throughout his life, and it became Louise's defining professional achievement, an institution that continued beyond both of them and that still operates today. What makes Tracy relevant to this list is not a secret child in the conventional sense, but a secret relationship to his acknowledged child, a distance maintained not from indifference, but from the specific kind of self-punishing guilt that operated as a wall between a father and a son across decades. John Tracy worked at the clinic his mother had built. Tracy supported it financially. The two of them existed in a proximity defined by institutional connection rather than domestic life. Katharine Hepburn, who was Tracy's companion for 26 years, never met Louise and never met John in any formal context. The two parts of Tracy's life, the public life with Hepburn and the private obligation to Louise and John, remained separated by the same Catholic logic that had refused to permit a divorce and had refused to permit a genuine family life simultaneously. Spencer Tracy died on June 10, 1967 in Beverly Hills, California, at the age of 67, 17 days after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Louise Treadwell was with him when he died. Katharine Hepburn was not. The secrets in this list were kept for different reasons. Some to protect careers, some to protect reputations, some to protect the children themselves, and some to protect the people doing the concealing from the consequences of choices they had made and could not publicly acknowledge. The industry that helped keep them provided the infrastructure and the incentive. The studio system was extraordinarily capable at managing information, and the press of the Golden Age era operated with a relationship to the major studios that was considerably more cooperative than the adversarial model that eventually replaced it. The children who were born into those secrets had no part in creating the situations they were placed in. Some found out the truth when they were young. Some found out as adults, long after the moment for any meaningful conversation had passed. Some, like Judith Lewis, who spent years knowing her mother's version of events before the full picture finally assembled, found out in stages that left each new piece of information arriving without the context to fully absorb it. What the decades since have produced, slowly and incompletely, is a fuller picture of what those studio-era arrangements actually contained. The women managed quietly out of public life, the children placed in institutional care and then retrieved, the financial settlements calibrated to ensure silence, and the careers protected at the cost of everything those protections required from the people they could not publicly acknowledge. If this kind of Hollywood history is what brings you here, hit that like button and subscribe. There is a lot more coming.